Welcome everyone to this day one of workshop on how to conduct practitioner research. Before I begin, I just request all the attendees that if you have any questions related to the talk, please put it on the Q&A section and not on the chat section, please. So I now request Professor Vidhu Shekhar, who is our Associate Head of Center for Financial Innovation and Assistant Professor in Finance and Economics Department of SPJIMR, to begin the session. Over to you, Vidhu, sir.
Okay, thanks a lot. Welcome everyone to this exciting webinar on practitioner research. So that's an interesting word, actually, practitioner research, because there can be a question where there can be a non-practice research, right? There can be a research which is not practice, right? So it's a kind of this thing. But what has happened over a period of time, that's a tendency of all kind of human social groups, and they tend to get limited to their area of working, say, and that at a macro scale has somewhat over a period of last century and this century, that academics have got a bit more closed group than it probably should have. This is especially true for works in economics and finance, where I typically find that academia and the practice world of finance rarely talk to each other. What is happening in the world of economics is, well, I mean, post 2008 is another thing altogether as well, right? So this bifurcation of what practitioners do and what researchers study has kind of kept widening, and if I may put it in, it may be one of the biggest challenges that is being faced by academia and scientific research in general, and academia in particular, that we have, right? And it's towards this that we here at CFI as well as at SPJIMR kind of have taken a conscious decision. It's in our vision statements as well, that we'll promote this practice research, where academia interacts more with practice and come up with the common research questions and work on them in close in a closed group kind of a scenario, right? And this is even more important with increasingly complex world, right? It has gotten so complex that you have one side banks failing, and other side AI doing big conversational engine and ChatGPT and stuff. Big innovation on one side and big failures on the other side, right? So increasingly VUCA world, increasingly complex world, definitely a need for practitioners and academicians to talk. And it is with this in mind that we have this webinar series that we are doing on, right? And towards that, and this is the first day we have with us, we are fortunate to have with us Nirupama Kulkarni. She's a distinguished senior research director at CAFRAL and has extensive experience in conducting academic and policy research in the areas of banking, household finance, real estate, monetary policy. She has worked very closely. CAFRAL, of course, is sponsored by RBI in that sense. So she works very closely with people who actually do practice in the area of economics as well as finance. Dr. Kulkarni is an undergraduate from IIT Bombay, an MBA from Stern School of Business, NYU, and a PhD from HAS at University of California at Berkeley, right? She has been a recipient of Fisher Center Fellowship at UC Berkeley, Fisher Center Research Grant at UC Berkeley, Vanier Family Foundation Grant at UC Berkeley, and was the FWA Clarion S. Walsh Memorial Scholar and Glucksman Research Fellow at the Stern School of Business. Nirupama, sorry if I have mispronounced any one of them, right? So I'm a typical, Desi Indian in that sense. So pardon me for that, but excellent achievements and congratulations for them. And I'll without delay, I'll hand over the platform to you, and if you can take us through the webinar on this, how to do practitioners research.
Okay, so that was excellent. Thanks for the kind introduction. But let me just tell you a little bit more about CAFRAL and what I do, because I think it will set the context for what I'm going to focus on. So the CAFRAL itself, at least in its current incarnation, it was set up about in 2006, or maybe in its current incarnation even in 2016, where the mandate was that we will produce academic research, and also we have another learning division. But the division that I am in, it's more on focused on academic research. So 80% of my time will be on academic research, and 20% is on policy work. And so I'm primarily, as a researcher at CAFRAL, I am judged based on the quality of my academic work. But the difference, because we are funded directly by RBI, the difference is that we have to make our work, our academic work, very accessible to central bankers, sometimes even more broadly to industry people, to practitioners. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what I've learned along the way. It was a steep learning curve, because I think academics talk differently, practitioners talk differently. And as Vidhu had mentioned, the one thing that I sort of differ slightly is that I don't think the questions itself, an academic can change very much the questions that they're looking at. But I think, so, that's not what I'll start from. I'll start from basically we have a paper, and then how to make that paper more accessible to practitioners, how to contextualize it. What are the, some of these are very basic things. Like, for example, using figures instead of tables, using pictures, and not that many, just throwing numbers at people. So let me just get started. So this is about converting an existing academic paper into industry relevant paper. And so the broad outline for today is, first I'll start from academic research itself and talk about the value of descriptive statistics. And this I sort of learned over the period that, when as an academic, I'm trying to make research accessible to practitioners. It not only helps publicize my research, helps it be broadly sort of used, but it also makes my academic research itself better. And so I'm going to talk about one particular thing, that is the value of descriptive statistics. And I've seen this increasingly being used in economics, in theory, it helps me even in getting published. And I'll talk a little bit about how sometimes papers become successful because they have this one striking figure, which basically tells you what the point of the research is. The second part, and I think we broadly know this, which is know your audience. In practitioner research, I include everybody. I include central bankers, I include policymakers, and I include people from the industry. And I think a little bit we need to cater to each of these groups a bit separately. My own experience has been more towards central bankers and policymakers, and sometimes towards people from the industry. And then I'll talk about two specific examples. One is a paper that I worked on biases in the sovereign ratings by credit rating agencies. And I'll focus on three specific things there: figures over tables, how to translate sort of a complicated, empirical analysis into something that practitioners will appreciate. And third is adding context, which itself sort of helps bridge the gap between why this question is important from an academic perspective, but why should the practitioner care. And another example, I'll talk about state-owned banks. This is a presentation that I did for again policymakers and industry people, and this basically relied on a bunch of papers, and I think there's some learnings from there. So I'll just walk you through how I approach both of these things. So the first is the value of descriptive analysis. Okay, and so here I'm going to focus more on the academic side of things itself. And the idea is that increasingly papers have started sort of doing very extensive descriptive analysis, which I think is a selling point for each of these papers. So again, this is going to go a little bit more on the academic side, but I still think it's informative. So in this, so basically, as academics, and these are slides I had actually used for, I teach a PhD course at ISB, and I had used these slides actually to talk to them. And again, this is about doing academic research, but I think it has lots of relevance for practitioner research. And so, usually as academics, we tend to focus more on the techniques, more on the economic techniques, and the fancier the economic technique, the better it is appreciated from an academic viewpoint. And so I don't know if people are familiar with this, but basically think of things like late effects, that is local average treatment effects, which, there's Imbens and Deaton who have argued, and Heckman who argued about like the validity of, using instrumental variables in our econometric techniques. So now, even when we use these kind of complicated methods, I think the simple descriptive analysis is useful and perhaps more difficult, especially for academics who tend to think in terms of causal analysis. Let me just caveat this a bit here. That is, my research tends to be very, very empirical. For theory, the approach might be very different. So I'm talking about mostly empirical research and how to translate that into something accessible for practitioners. And so even in academic papers, a simple descriptive analysis is very useful and almost very difficult to do. And I want to give the example of two papers, one of them which might even be relevant to many people here, which is by Prachin Mishra, Nirupama Kulkarni, and Raghuram Rajan. And this is based on the credit registry data at CIBIL. And then in labor, which is again, labor in economics has a lot of influence on how corporate finance is, the empirical analysis in corporate finance happens. And so I think this paper is also very influential. This is by Chetty, Henry, Klein, and Sayers. And this this analysis has also been very widely covered. So you will see it in New York Times. It's very it's been like publicized very much in policy. I think even Hillary Clinton had like approached these guys when she was running for president to talk about the analysis they had done. So this is very influential work. And the reason it's been influential is the way they have approached it and the way they have made it accessible to non-academics. Okay, so first this paper by Mishra, Prabhala, and Rajan. So the idea here is, okay, so basically the idea in this paper was to look at why banks differ in the pace at which they adopt new technology. And they basically look at the introduction of the credit registry in India in 2007, and they examine the differential response of state-owned banks versus the private sector banks. And within private sector banks, there are private sector banks which have been more newly set up versus the older private sector banks. And they sort of like look at, and this is almost a very pure descriptive paper. And the main takeaway here is that the new private sector banks adopt new technology more quickly for all borrowers, whereas public sector banks or state-owned banks adopt this new technology only for newer borrowers, but their legacy borrowers actually, they're much more lenient towards them. And so the legacy assets are much more of an issue for state-owned banks. And this is almost very consistent with our prior. Right, and so their whole analysis is based on some really very simple descriptive statistics. So if you look at it here, if you look at all nodes, basically they show that the delinquency rates are higher for public sector banks. Let's just focus on one category, which is the lowest credit score borrowers, that is less than 650 credit score borrowers. And so the delinquency rates for public sector banks are the higher for public sector banks versus private sector banks. And this is in a sense, the gist of their entire paper. And they build on this simple observation without even that many complicated sort of econometric techniques. Okay, and the difference seems to be driven entirely by borrowers which have prior relationship with the public sector banks. And again, coming to the issue of these are all driven by these legacy assets. So if you look at loans which have prior relation, public sector banks, again, we look at the worst borrowers. The delinquency rate is higher compared to the new private, the borrowers for the new private banks. Okay. And I think this is, but that's the basic point. So basically using just these simple summary statistics, they are able to motivate their paper. And this itself is a very striking finding. And this has been published well in academic journal. So this is another paper, again, very influential in labor and especially in the US. And in this paper, the authors look at intergenerational mobility in the United States, and they basically use administrative records. They use tax records on incomes for more than 40 million children and their parents to describe features of intergenerational mobility. And the idea is to look at what happens to the incomes of children based on where their parents were in the income distribution. And so basically, they just look at this joint distribution of the parental income and children's income at the national level. And the main takeaway in their, this is a series of papers, but in their first paper, the main takeaway is that the conditional expectation of children's income given parents' income is basically linear. That is, if my parent was well off, then I'm more likely to be well off. And so the idea is that how well I do in life depends a lot on like who my parents are. And they also then move on to show that this is actually determined by where these children stay. So especially in the US, they identify these high mobility areas, and they find that these areas where where my outcomes don't depend as much on my parents' outcomes, in those areas they have, those areas have less, or those cities are less segregated, less residentially segregated, have lower income inequality, have better schools, have greater social capital, and have greater financial stability. Again, all channels and mechanisms through which I might be able to do, well as an adult, irrespective of who my parents are. And so so while descriptive analysis does not identify specifically the causal mechanisms, and something which we're very obsessed about in academic research, so while descriptive analysis does not identify the causal mechanism that determines upward mobility, this massive administrative data actually allows these authors to develop these intergenerational mobility measures across the US. And the subsequent papers actually build on this sort of analysis. And again, they have a very nice infographic, which is very easily available to practitioners. People can just point and click and then look at the intergenerational mobility measures, maybe in their neighborhood or like across the US. And that, I think, has been very critical in making the academic research more broadly accessible, and policymakers also use it. It's also been covered widely in newspapers and so on. And so again, just give you a sense of like what they look at. They basically look at you rank the parents' income between 0 and 100. You rank children's income between 0 and 100. And then if you look at the slope, the rank slope, you find that for say Denmark, the slope is flatter. And for the US, the slope is more steep. And the idea is that, in the US, who your parents are matter much more than in Denmark. And this is the key takeaway sort of picture. This is the paper that is like the money slide, the one that sort of makes or breaks the paper. And to come up with, and this is the basis of a series of, I think there must be at least about 10 papers now. And increasingly they build on just this basic insight, and obviously to get at something this even to get at like this stage, I think it takes a lot of time, but it makes this kind of money slide sort of makes the paper easy to understand, and it's like in one slide they're able to convey the entire gist of the paper. And so even in academic research, I think we're all increasingly trying to get at that one slide, one picture, which sort of conveys pretty much anything that everybody wants to take away from from like a research paper. And even if you go to my website, I usually have each paper description. I usually put the money slide on my website, because I think it pretty much conveys what there is, the one figure which is the main takeaway of the entire paper. Okay, so this is just again giving the intergenerational mobility across geographies. Yeah, I'll skip this. So this is the money slide, and so one slide just defines the paper. Okay, so again, this is another influential paper which looked at the impact of the 2003 dividend tax cut. And the main takeaway from the paper is that the tax cut in 2003 did not have much of an effect on investment, employee compensation, or payouts to shareholders. And so they just look at these C and S corporations, one of which had for which the 2000 dividend tax cut applied, and the other which didn't. And then they find that the effects are very similar. So if you look at all the trends, you don't actually see any stark difference after the tax cuts were implemented. And these 4 figures, or maybe even this one figure, basically defines the main takeaway from the paper. So from an academic perspective, it sort of is convincing as a reader to look at something so simple and then to appreciate the fact that, yes, I can believe that there was no effect. And obviously, the paper itself would have done a lot more work to make this point. But this is what, like, I guess these papers published. I'll skip this. This is a bit more complicated. So from my own paper, one of my papers, which I think this will come up even later on when I'm talking about state-owned banks. But the basic premise of this paper was that the public sector banks, during the global financial crisis, public sector banks fared much better than private sector banks. And this we actually find that it's more attributable to the flight of deposits, the flight of deposits by panicked depositors away from private sector banks to public sector banks. And so we look at just the stock market index of indices of public and private sector banks, and you see that right after Lehman Brothers collapsed in September 2008, there was a divergence in public sector banks and private sector banks. And again, this is like the one slide that sort of makes this main point about what was happening. Maybe the stock market index might not be a direct one. Now, in the newer version of the paper, we have put an even more direct slide. Let's just look at deposits for private and public sector banks. And we see the same divergence in the deposit growth of private and public sector banks. And it's pretty striking when you look at it in the aggregate, especially when you look at the pre-trend and find that there's not much happening there. So the moral of the story is, even in academic research, I think we need to spend a lot of time on our figures. And this is a nice slide from, I think this is PhD comics, which says that always label your axis so that your enemies know what you're plotting. And again, the point is that it is very, very possible, no matter how complicated the research question is, to summarize the main takeaway in just one figure. And that doesn't mean that the paper is simple. That just means that you've spent a lot of time thinking about how to make the main takeaway very, very, very concise. And this, I think, sort of needs to be repeated, because a little bit in academia, especially early on, I think we are, we're misguided by this fact that the more complicated your theory is, the more complicated, your empirical analysis, the more complicated the econometric analysis, the better the paper is, because it sort of displays all the cool things that you can do. But it's not. It's, in the end, I think what you want is something that is believable, something that people know is true. And for that, you actually need to simplify your story a lot. And that usually comes when, you spend a lot of time on this sort of like this one money slide. Okay, and now I move on to the next part, which is, know your audience. I think we all know this a bit, but this is something that I have myself learned, that there is a difference between practitioners, that is people from the industry, from central bankers. And the main sort of difference is that, sometimes you're talking, especially in central banking, a lot of these people are, a lot of, my colleagues in RBI are PhDs. So they understand sometimes the shorthand that we use to convey, whether like, like the econometric technique that we have used, or maybe, some kind of corporate finance theory that we are thinking about, or the model that we have at the back of our mind. Whereas when we go to practitioners, I think it's very, we need to make sure that it's not so, when we're conveying that research, it's not so jargon laden. And a little bit, we have a tendency to position, our findings next to existing literature, which again, as academics, we care about that because that is how we get published. But industry folks might not care about that much. What they want to know is, how can they use this? Why is this relevant for them? And so we have to be a bit clear about, where this is coming from, who our target audience is. Okay, so now let me just go on to the examples. The first example is this is a project that we did on looking at the biases in sovereign credit ratings by the credit rating agencies. And the main finding from that, and this is, we have modified the paper to make it more policy oriented. And the main finding from this paper is that credit rating changes, especially during crisis periods, tend to not be good predictors of sovereign default. And this tends to be much more the case for the credit rating agencies, which rely on more subjective information as opposed to more quantitative information. So, for example, we looked at Fitch, Moody's, and S&P, and I think Moody's, which relies on more qualitative information, actually performed worse in terms of the ability to predict, for credit ratings to predict defaults. Okay, so the first set of presentations that we did was to the RBI, to central bankers, and some of the things that we found useful was, so here is something that is like, so use figures over tables. Okay, so for example, we're using principal component analysis, which again, now I think everybody is aware of what principal component analysis is, but still it doesn't hurt to make it a little bit more accessible. So so just from this one figure, one can appreciate what is happening with Fitch, S&Ps, and Moody's. That is, how much do institutional factors influence ratings of Fitch, S&P, or Moody's? And you can see that both the institutional factors as well as fiscal factors are much more important compared to economic or other external factors. And so in just this one slide, and this is basically 4 different tables. We are basically able to say that better institutional quality and fiscal position matter the most for ratings, whereas economic and external factors have limited effect. The second part is, I think, what has been useful in translating the empirical the results from an empirical analysis is translating the effects that we find into economic magnitudes. And so again, from the sovereign credit rating agencies and biases, if you look at again, these are again a bunch of, we are again looking at the changes in ratings and then looking at how this predicts sovereign default. And just showing those bunch of tables, I think is again not so accessible. Instead, looking at the economic magnitude of what this means, that is able to better convey what we are sort of thinking about. And this again is looking at, just again making the point that pictures are better than words. And here basically, we are showing just for Fitch, we're looking at the 1 year ahead default incidence across ratings. And we find, and this is the 5 year ahead default incidence. And we find that the prediction power for these ratings is actually much worse, especially for this investment grade, which is this threshold, which is very important, especially from an investor's perspective. And so, especially in the medium term, this relationship is not so clear. That is, the higher the rating, the less should be a default. But here you find that this is not so linear. And again, this makes a simple point that the ratings are not a good predictor of default rates. Okay, and so now I'll come to the last part, that is adding context and building on body of work. And so the other thing that I have realized is that, even conveying the results from an academic paper, I think it needs to be contextualized a lot. And so, for example, in this particular presentation that follows, I was asked to present on state-owned banks and the challenges for the global south, which is, if you look at my research, I'm actually very focused on banking in India. And so the challenge was sort of making this a bit broader, a bit more targeted towards people who might be interested in something, about the global south. And there I found that just adding some context to how do state banks look in emerging market economies, how does state ownership of banks look throughout the global south. That was helpful in setting the stage. That state-owned banks basically dominate in emerging market economies, and they play a relatively much lower role in advanced economies. And of course, this we all know, that is, what is the role of state-owned banks? They basically cater to marginal borrowers. They can provide stability during crisis periods. You saw this happen a lot during the COVID period, where many governments basically relied on the state-owned banks to give subsidized credit to households and firms. And much of the COVID period was also accompanied by regulations which basically allowed the forbearance towards these households and firms. And however, there's a large sort of academic literature which talks about inefficiencies in state ownership. These inefficiencies can actually manifest during crisis periods. And the main takeaway from a bunch of papers of mine is that the cleanup of these inefficiencies due to state ownership of banks is actually particularly difficult. And so to basically convey this main message of my papers, I combined a bunch of academic papers which, again, look at each of these points one by one. And the tendency in academic work is to basically say one thing, but say it like well. Right, so a bunch of papers on state-owned banking. I had looked at the forbearance schemes in India, which were implemented during post the GFC, and then I looked at the buildup of stressed assets post the GFC, and then I looked at the various measures that were taken by RBI to basically address this buildup of stressed assets. So basically bankruptcy code, that's IBC, and then there were a bunch of related sort of regulations such as the Feb 12 circular, for those who are familiar with this, and so on. And again, people might not be so interested in India itself and these specific historical episodes, but there are learnings from there which will be applicable even post-COVID, because again, post-COVID, we went back to the same playbook. We again implemented these forbearance schemes, which we had done during the global financial crisis, and found that they did not work as well. In fact, they had a tendency to make even a bad situation worse. And I think that pretty much sums up, all the things that I plan to cover today. But basically, the next bunch of slides look at the different ways in which I combine these sort of different aspects of state ownership, and especially post-crisis period, and the implications that has for thinking of this more broadly in a global context. These slides are just about contextualizing again the main setup, that is state-owned banks. Are actually they have a lot of inefficiencies. They tend to be, especially during this period, they were also poorly capitalized, something that you also saw during the global financial crisis, and which had implications for the way they sort of use the forbearance schemes that were implemented then. And so this is sort of the main sort of takeaway here, which is, if you look at the capital to assets ratio for private, public, and public banks, you find that, and then compare so public sector banks had higher capital to assets ratio compared to private among the advanced economies, but for the emerging economies, it was actually the reverse. But when you look at the non-performing loans over gross loans, you find that the non-performing loans were actually lower for public sector banks compared to private sector banks. And this would be surprising, again, thinking about how India itself, how we think of the public sector banks in India. But if you sort of look at what was happening during that time, let me make just this similar point, which is after the global financial crisis, what India introduced these forbearance schemes, which essentially allowed the banks to treat restructured assets as if they were standard assets. So you didn't see the non-performing assets sort of blow up, but you saw a lot of loans being restructured. And this is very similar to, again, what we saw in the previous slide. That is, NPA itself, you might not see much, but when you look at all these other restructured assets where we are pretending as if they are not non-performing loans, you see the buildup. So the last part, I'll end with this, which is the last part is basically contextualizing the research findings, and sometimes our academic papers especially tend to be a bit narrow. So it's a little bit more useful to actually combine a bunch of papers, combine the findings from a bunch of papers, and then streamline it in one takeaway. And this is easier to do if, like, our research itself sort of, it builds on one particular theme. Sometimes, as academics, we tend to just have different themes. So, this might not be applicable for everyone. But usually I believe that, a bunch of papers actually helps. It helps both in research itself, and also it makes it a little bit more easier to sell to a practitioner audience. I'll end with that. This is, again, very, very specific to the context I was talking about. Yeah, let me end with that.
Thank you, Dr. Kulkarni. That was very insightful. We would now take questions. So if anybody has questions, they can put in the Q&A section. So actually, I have a question. So all of these research papers, we build a PhD thesis on research papers, right? A lot of times. So if we want to convert it into something practitioner oriented, because thesis goes in the, some shelf, and then we hardly see them getting. So what is again the key point to make that, convert the thesis into a more practitioner relevant paper?
So thesis is actually a good place, because usually I think in a thesis, it's not just one paper. There is already, you're forced to have a coherent theme. It's about 3 papers or 2 to 3 papers. And so I think that's a good place to start. You already have some knowledge about, about the broader topic. I think this is, again, my personal belief. I don't think it's like that much about the question. It's just about the translation. It's just about translating how you convert what you have done to something that practitioners would care about. And every paper of mine, I've found that, okay, what might sell more from an academic perspective is not necessarily what a practitioner is interested in. So, for example, one of the first papers I spoke about was on how there was a switch in depositors moving away from private sector banks to public sector banks. Now, in something like that, when I'm writing the academic piece, I'm focusing more on what does it say in context of the literature. So the feedback that we got from when we sent it for publication, the feedback that we got was, okay, what do I learn? What is this new thing that I learned? It's like so specific to India. Is there anything for me to learn, from an academic sense? And so we spoke about how because state-owned banks have these government guarantees, and they end up actually using these deposit inflows to redirect. So they get these deposit inflows. They also increase their credit, but they increase their credit to actually worse forms. These public sector banks also have, sort of higher buildup in NPAs, in non-performing assets. And so there we talk about how, because of these government guarantees, after runs, you sort of need to be careful about how credit is allocated. So the literature itself talks about how bank runs can be cleansing. So this process of creative destruction, that is, credit is taken away from firms which should fail, and that actually has beneficial effects on the entire economy. So that is, again, very interesting from an academic's perspective, but it's not so interesting from for somebody in policy making or from the practitioner perspective. And so when I was explaining these sort of set of results, I spoke more about how you see this pattern repeated again and again. You saw this during the global financial crisis. You also saw it a bit during COVID also, where there was again, the public sector banks started doing a bit better than private sector banks. Of course, after that, a lot of other things happened. But the perspective sort of changes. The way you have pitched your paper will be very, for an academic journal, will be very, very different compared to something for policymakers or industry folks. And the second thing is that sometimes the results itself might, would be your main result for an academic paper might be different from what would be your main result for a practitioner oriented paper. So, for example, even in the same context, I would focus more on the credit side, how credit loans turn into NPA loans for maybe the, for the pitch in the academic journal. But for the practitioner side, I think even this basic first stage sort of fact that deposit flows moved away from private to public is itself interesting. Yeah.
Okay.
And the rest of it is interesting. Credit is interesting. The fact that it turned into non-performing loans is also interesting. But the first stage effect is also, is relevant. It is something that we, would want to focus on. So once you're not bound by these shackles of, of positioning yourself in the literature, what is unique, what is new, but what is interesting. I think that's like the little bit of perspective change.
That's true even for literature when we're doing literature review. So when we're writing an academic paper, we focus too much on the gap in the literature, right? That's what we are doing. But in industry, it might be different. So how for an industry perspective, do we kind of provide insights from that literature?
So I'm not very sure about this because, I have noticed that my tendency to put on my academic hat and then think about, what is interesting from an academic perspective and hope that, that will be interesting to a practitioner perspective. I think it doesn't work. It doesn't because it's just that the two, I think this is what even Vidhu was mentioning, that sometimes academics tend to be a bit insular. They tend to cater to their own crowd. So I find this even as an Indian academic sitting here, that I have to sometimes cater my research question to a US crowd because the journals, the editors sit there, the referees sit there, right? And so it might not be that relevant, and sometimes the positioning is all wrong. So for example, I'm thinking about some things that I'm doing more recently. So I'm looking at non-banking financial companies, NBFCs. And my tendency when I write the academic paper is to position it next to the NBFCs in the US. But the NBFCs in the US are very different from the NBFCs in India. So when I start a sort of an industry oriented paper with this kind of positioning, they get it's very irritating, right? It's it almost makes it seem as if I don't know anything about the Indian context, right? Because it's a tendency to do it because, again, the audience is very different when I'm doing the academic piece. But from a practitioner piece, that kind of positioning doesn't help. A lot of the academic literature tends to be US focused, especially empirically. And so a lot of it is not very translatable. Sometimes, these kind of, it's almost like a case study, you can do it, but I think sometimes it backfires. So it's very context specific. So for example, state-owned banks, that I can imagine that, I can make it a bit more broader. But NBFCs, I especially for the practitioner side, I'm not very sure that, that is the right approach.
Okay. Any other questions? Thank you, Dr. Nirupama. So we have a question. What is your take on data collection for practitioner research? And what is the best technique to collect the data? Is it correct to rely on third-party data?
So it depends. So for example, a lot of the data that I use is sometimes, regulatory, sometimes third-party data. And there I think a little bit of the academic part is sort of helpful because we, there is usually a body of work that you're building on. So others have used it, others have, complained about bad data. For example, I think, some of the data sets we have on employment. I think there's been a lot of back and forth, and I think even the referees and journals have realized that, and I think you all know what I'm talking about, but basically, some of the referees also realize that this data is a bit, might be a bit sketchy and may not be as reliable. So whatever we rely on for academic research, I think the same rules apply. And usually, again, we are like getting sometimes. So, for example, for the NBFC report, for the banking side, for my papers on banking, the data is very reliable. We just used what was given to us by RBI. That is what's there on the RBI website. And for NBFC now, this is like this whole black box where you don't know, no matter what, you're never going to capture the universe of NBFCs. You are just going to capture a part of it. Even RBI only regulates a part of the NBFCs, not all the NBFCs that ever exist, right? So there we just relied on multiple sources. So we knew that we had this we were all capturing like sort of different parts of this elephant, and each one had like a different insight. But and there was no hope of getting the entire universe. So so approaching this from multiple sort of angles helped us even believe our own results. And I don't think it's that bad relying on third-party data, but even at the back of our mind, we should be clear about how reliable this data is, to be very, very clear about the limitations, the scope of the data, how this data was collected. That I think if you let people know upfront what you're capturing and what you're not, I think people are okay with it. People are a bit hesitant when they see that when you're trying to make these broad generalizable claims and the data driving it is actually just is just like a small sample of the entire universe.
Right.
So on this data, I also have a quick question. How do you get, when you of course are from CAFRAL, so I assume you have a lot of data access, at least from the RBI, but no.
So
they don't even give you the data.
Yeah, regulatory data doesn't seem. Regulatory data is for they have a lot of disclosure requirements, right? So it can't be shared that easily. So a lot of our data comes from the same places that you would get your data from, that is from publicly available sources, and the rest I think we just pay for it. The proprietary data like Prowess, CMIE, and others, we pay for these subscriptions, Reuters and so on.
So who is doing research on let's say internal data of RBI? RBI themselves are doing it?
Sorry?
Who is doing the research on the internal data of RBI? They would themselves be doing it?
They would themselves do it, and it goes through vetting, and it's mostly for internal purposes.
What about data from let's say other places like NSE, BSE and those guys? Because publicly available, they have shared some data is not there. It's a mess. Even RBI is a bit of a mess these days. But
no, I think I don't know. From what I have noticed is that data is, you can get a lot of this data online. It takes some effort. I can sort of understand that yes, sometimes the interface tends to be a bit not so user friendly. But with some effort, it's there. Sometimes even manipulating your way around some of these websites is a bit difficult, but I think it is there. The other thing that I've noticed is that people have started using sort of non-traditional data sources, and that I find that it gives a lot of insight. So for example, satellite imagery and things like that, especially to look at economic activity. It is some work, but it is again, this is the kind of data even regulators don't have access to.
right.
Okay, so there's one more question. Academic research tends to be under specific conditions. When we presented for practitioners, how do we ensure that the same is not generalized across the spectrum rather than only for specific conditions?
I think caveated, as in, like I said, even for example, the last example that I gave, it was, my work tends to be on India, and it's very specific to, one specific, event that happened, or the specific regulatory environment in India. But I still think there is a lot of generalizability, right? So you can always sort of start, and we tend to even worry about the external validity of our findings, even in academic research. So I think we're already doing a little bit of that work. But as long as we caveat it out, as long as we're super clear about, about the fact that we're looking at one specific sort of instance, I don't think that should be that much of a problem. Yeah.
Okay. So I think, any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question. So as an academician, when we start to do our research and we try to frame a research problem, we rely more on the existing literature, and we tend to go back to the literature and revisit it as many times to identify that research gap and come out with it, and then frame a research problem. But at times, what we've also noticed is that those kinds of research problems that are coming from the literature point of view are more academic oriented and theoretically based. But when we talk about doing research on those kinds of questions and coming out with it from an industry perspective, its relevance is not that much. So how is it, what do you think is the right approach to come down to that kind of a research problem for an academician who has limited access to, they don't know what is actually the existing problems in the outer world, they're not sitting in the industry, neither they have the contacts, we are exposed to more of the databases and the existing databases and the literature that is already there in a particular field. So what do you think, how they should take this approach, and how they should, try and come down to framing a research problem that equally has a good relevance for the industry folks?
So I'll tell you how I think about it, and how I have approached this, which is that like you rightly mentioned, in academia you tend to every time I have an idea, everybody's like, okay, tell me what is the economics, right? And that's where the academics are motivated from. But I've realized that the thing that seems to be relevant for both from an academic perspective and from what policymakers would find interesting, is that, do I want to answer this question? Do I want to find the answer to this question? If somebody told me what the answer to this question, would I be interested? And obviously, that's selfishly motivated, because that's how I will spend more time on my own research question. But it also is a good gauge of what others would find interesting. And there is this back and forth. So usually I know that this is what I want to look at, right? For NBFCs, this is I want to look at why the NBFCs grow during right around the time that banks are doing poorly. And so the question emanates more from what I find interesting, rather than do I have again, in very academic speak, do I have a valid instrument, which I think is a very bad way to look at things. That is, oh, I have an instrument, now let me go hunt around for some, I have this hammer, let me go hunt around for some nail to bang it on. It's because it's it's boring to listen to, it's boring to consume, it's boring to produce, it's boring all around. Okay, it might get published, and it's I do want to get published. So it's not that I've never done something like this, but it's after I've done it, after with how many years of experience that I have right now, I think I've learned that it's dull for everybody. It's there's no I don't think I would be able to convert it into a practitioner oriented piece. I've never some of these papers I've never put it into these kind of broad presentation. So I think that's just a good test. That is would you want to know the answer to this question? And then of course, when you have to publish in a journal, obviously the point to make is do I feel what gap in the literature am I addressing, right? But the place to start is maybe again, maybe at the stage in which we approach these questions. But this is been my, it's a very personal taste. I don't know whether it's everybody needs to follow the same approach, because sometimes just something super abstract is like interesting. I might be even interesting for practitioners later on, but for me to motivate myself to do research, this is the approach I'll follow.
Right.
Thank you. So I think we are almost out of time here. So could you stop sharing your screen, please, Dr. Nirupama? Yeah. Okay. So yeah. So thank you, Dr. Nirupama, for this insightful session. I think we will benefit greatly, and all the attendees will also now have a better understanding of how, if they have a academic research papers, how to go about and convert it into a more practitioner focused research. Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Vidhu. Thank you so for being here.